The woman who finally broke her silence for 20 years, she made a deliberate choice to remain invisible. Maria Francisca Perello, called Mary by most, and Ziska by those who knew her as a child, constructed her public persona around a single guiding idea. The story was never about her. That idea held steady for 2 decades. Then speculation began swirling online about her retired husband and a rising young tennis talent from the Philippines. So Mary stepped forward. What she said surprised everyone, not through drama, but through its remarkable calm and clarity. The legend and the woman behind him, Rafa Nadal's career belongs in the realm of sports mythology. 22 Grand Slam championships. 14 titles at Roland Garros alone. A forehand that seemed to bend the laws of physics. The world spent 2 decades watching him fight through pain, break through barriers, and achieve things no one believed possible. Through every moment of it, a woman stood nearby, largely unnoticed by the outside world. Mary is no passive observer in life. She holds a business degree from the University of the Balearic Islands and pursued postgraduate studies at USAID in Barcelona. Since 2012, she has run the Rafa Nadal Foundation, climbing to the role of CEO and steering its charitable mission for over a decade. She built a professional identity entirely her own. Her reasoning for staying private was always clear-headed. In her own words, she believed that following Rafa to every corner of the world would have slowly suffocated their relationship, that building her own separate life was the healthiest thing she could do for both of them. So she stayed quiet.
Purposefully. Consistently.
Until something changed. The girl from the Philippines with an impossible dream, Alexandra Eala, grew up in a Filipino household where sport ran through the bloodline. Her mother had competed at the Southeast Asian Games as a swimmer. Her brother pursued tennis at the college level in America. And from the age of 13, Alexandra carried an ambition that most would have considered too bold to speak aloud. That ambition eventually carried her to Manacor, Mallorca, to the academy built on Nadal's competitive philosophy. She arrived in 2018 as a promising junior and spent years immersed in the same culture of discipline, mental resilience, and relentless hard work that had shaped one of sport's greatest champions. She wasn't just passing through. She was being formed. In 2023, she graduated from the Rafa Nadal Academy at a ceremony where world number 1 Iga Swiatek served as keynote speaker. That detail alone signals how seriously the tennis world was beginning to take her. By 2025, at the Miami Open, Eala made history. She became the first Filipino player ever to reach the semifinals of a WTA 1000 tournament, doing so as a 19-year-old by beating top 10 players including Madison Keys and Swiatek herself. She played like someone who had always known she deserved to be on those courts. From retirement, Nadal sent her a personal message, the first he had ever sent her directly. Eala later described the moment with emotion, noting that she only saw the notification days after Miami because of how hectic that week had been. 6 years of training within his system, and the first private message from the man himself arrived to mark a historic achievement. That kind of connection goes beyond mentorship. It resembles family. Mary Perello witnessed all of it from the inside. And then, after 2 decades of chosen silence, she spoke. Here is a rewrite of this section. 1 year later, he picked up a racket again November 19, 2025. Exactly 12 months after Nadal's tearful farewell in Malaga, surrounded by family, his legendary career finally laid to rest. A full year of retirement had passed. Mornings in Mallorca, fatherhood, golf, foundation commitments, and the quiet that follows a lifetime of war. Then, on that precise anniversary, he walked back onto a tennis court. Not for a comeback. Not for an exhibition. Not for sponsors or spectacle. He did it for Alexandra Eala. The two shared a training session at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Manacor, and the footage spread across the internet almost instantly. Audiences watched the 22-time Grand Slam champion trade long baseline rallies with a young Filipino star who had grown up inside the very system he built. Nadal posted on social media afterward, saying it felt wonderful to be back on court after a year, and called Eala out directly, noting it had been great to practice with her and promising he would be stronger next time. Eala responded on Instagram in 2 short messages, a thank you, and then the line that stuck with everyone, back like you never left. The internet caught fire. Videos accumulated millions of interactions across every platform. Filipino fans were emotional. Spanish fans were stunned. Tennis followers everywhere replayed the footage of 2 left-handed players, one a retired giant, one an emerging force, exchanging ground strokes on an indoor court in Mallorca as though the rest of the world had briefly paused. Eala described the experience with unguarded feeling, saying it was something young players could only dream about, that sharing the court with Rafa was a true privilege, and that she was hitting with him for the very first time in her life, a memory she would carry forever. Somewhere in that building or watching from home was Mary Perello, a woman who had spent 20 years carefully protecting the private world she and Rafa had built together, who had developed an entire philosophy around keeping their interior life sacred, who had watched the world constantly reach for pieces of her husband and had always, without exception, held the line. Now she watched him return to tennis for a 20-year-old from the Philippines, and she felt something she had not anticipated. The question the internet was already forming would not stay quiet much longer. What the internet did with a beautiful moment, the initial reaction to the anniversary session, was largely what any reasonable person would hope for. Celebration, admiration, deep pride from Filipino supporters who had followed Eala's entire journey from junior prospect to world top 50, all within the academy her idol had founded. It was a genuinely moving story, and most people received it that way. But the internet never rests at beautiful. Among the millions of posts and reposts, a smaller but persistent group began asking different questions. Why had Rafa chosen to mark this particular anniversary, with Eala specifically? What did their closeness actually mean? Why was the man who had always described family as everything back on court for a young woman his wife had never publicly acknowledged? Details that had previously gone unnoticed were suddenly circulating. Eala's coach, Joan Bosch, had spoken about how Nadal personally stepped in to guide Eala at the academy, not from any obligation, but because he felt a genuine connection to the challenges she was navigating. He had picked up a racket and demonstrated serves directly, leaving Eala visibly stunned. Bosch described it simply as the good fortune of being inside the Rafa Nadal Academy. Seen fresh, those details read differently to a certain corner of the internet. Speculation spread. Forums lit up across multiple languages. YouTube channels constructed narrative videos. Hashtags multiplied. Because when a famously private public figure allows even a sliver of their personal world to become visible, the gap between what is known and what is imagined fills quickly, and not always generously. Mary Perello had spent over 2 decades saying nothing, explaining nothing, stepping into none of it. She had held that position with remarkable consistency. But this time was different. And eventually, she made her choice to speak. What Mary actually said, the world had built its expectations in advance. Some anticipated jealousy, a wife drawing a line. Others expected a polished, arm's-length statement from the foundation CEO. Others expected continued silence, the default she had always kept. None of those expectations were met. What Mary offered instead was something that could only come from a woman who had watched her husband pour himself, his body, his focus, his emotional reserves, into a sport for 2 decades. She had watched him compete through serious injury. She had watched him weep in press conferences. She had watched him retire at the Davis Cup with their young son in the crowd and tears on a face that had carried every form of exhaustion imaginable. And then she had watched him walk back onto a court, 1 year later, with a visible light behind his eyes that she recognized at once. In speaking about Eala, Mary is reported to have conveyed that she understood completely why Rafa had formed such a meaningful bond with the young Filipino player. Mentoring Eala was not a detour from retirement. It was a natural continuation of who he had always been. The academy was never simply a business venture or a branding exercise. It was Rafa's answer to a question that every great athlete eventually faces. Where does the drive go when the competition ends? It was his way of ensuring that the values he had lived by, discipline, humility, the refusal to accept limits, still had somewhere meaningful to travel. Eala was the living evidence that it had worked. In his retirement farewell, Nadal had spoken directly to his family, describing his wife as his perfect companion through everything and saying that coming home to her and watching their son grow had been his anchor throughout his career. That is the lens through which Mary understood the Eala story. Not as competition for her husband's attention, not as a complication, but as a continuation of the man she had first fallen for as a teenager in Mallorca, a man whose instinct, when he saw a young athlete struggling, was not to look away, but to pick up a racket and demonstrate exactly what he meant. Her words, by all accounts, carried no defensiveness. They carried pride. She spoke about Rafa with the ease of someone who has never once doubted who he is. She spoke about Eala not as an intrusion into their story, but as a chapter in his legacy, and therefore in hers as well. The internet had prepared itself for conflict. What it received was grace. And that, more than anything, was what left people speechless.